Today we're going to talk about historical trauma and the contributing events. Historical trauma is defined as the accumulative emotional and psychological pain over an individual's lifespan and across generations as a result of massive group trauma. Many older Alaska Natives grew up in a time when the basic foundation of the social life that bonds Alaska Native culture and communities together was damaged. Many people believe that the soul and psyche of generations of Alaska Native peoples have inherited the pain, loss, and frustration of their ancestors. As a result, loss of cultural patterns, identities, friendship, relationships, and unresolved massive psychic traumas, many Alaska Natives are experiencing chronic social problems today. The first non-native contact these communities had was with Russian explorers and traders who came to Alaska pursuing wealth acquired from trading sea otter pelts. The Russians were very abusive, often raping native women, breaking up families, and relocating them. The Aleuts were possibly the most affected by Russian explorers and traders. The Russians forced the men to hunt sea otters for them, taking them away from their families, leaving the women to hunt, to fish and gather. Russian orthodoxy was forced on the Aleuts, and they could no longer practice traditional beliefs associated with the hunting and gathering lifestyle. Also affected were the Koniag and Chugach, who were forced into raiding Tlingit villages and able to help the Russians gain power in Tlingit territory. The Tlingit were skilled warriors and had managed to deter the Russians until just after 1804, when they eventually tolerated Russian presence. For remote groups like the Athabascans and the Inupiat, contact with the Russians was predominantly indirect, and Russia established no settlements in these territories. Based on the varying impact of Russian presence on Alaska Natives, Russians recognized three categories of Alaska Natives. The Aleut, Koniag, and Chugach were recognized in the first group, considered Russian subjects. The second group was most likely the Tlingit, not wholly dependent tribes that lived near Russian settlement but did not enjoy duties or privileges. The third group, the Inupiat and the Athabascans, were independent tribes that had little interaction with the Russians. The Russians viewed the third group as uncivilized or savages. The missionary era is another contributing source of the historical trauma experienced by Alaska Natives. The missionaries arrived just a few years after Alaska was sold to the United States. The U.S. government was interested in removing indigenous people because they were a barrier to Western expansion. Missionaries dispersed across Alaska after dividing up its geographical regions, determining which denomination would control each area. The missionaries served as the eyes and the ears of the government, and in some cases used the threat of the U.S. Revenue Service cannon to assert their own authority. The goal of acculturating Alaska Natives meant destroying their identity through loss of language, food, spiritual belief system, family patterns, art, and traditional dance and song. For example, the Quakers measured their success in conversion by Alaska Natives' adherence to a strict code of conduct. They prohibited drinking, tobacco use, dancing, gambling, and working on Sundays. In many villages, Alaska Natives were forced to give up their children to be educated in boarding schools by the missionaries. They forbade the children from any traditional practice, including speaking their native language, and if they disobeyed, the children were punished harshly and even shamed. Now I want to show you a video explaining what the historical trauma that one remote Alaskan village experienced.
The abuse in St. Michael would continue for 5 more years, as Ben and the others suffered almost daily molestation. Then, one day, in the summer of 1975, Joseph Landowski would finally be caught in the act.
My cousin Martha came and she saw what Joseph was doing, and she screamed and she said, "Oh, Ben, I'm gonna go tell, I'm gonna go tell." He went after her and try to give her money or candy just to stop her from talking. She says, no, leave me alone, and then she went running out.
As word spread, pressure mounted on Father Endall to act.
The police were not called. Even when there was an eyewitness to the abuse, the authorities were not called. The church handled it internally. Landowski was transported out of the town and left the state, and as far as we know, never returned.
But Father Endall stayed. Through it all, he remained revered and above suspicion. Although for 8 more years, he would continue to molest the boys and girls of St. Michael. Under Father Endall's watch, nearly 80% of the town's children, literally an entire generation, were molested.
The odds of being abused as a little Catholic boy or a little Catholic girl in that diocese was staggeringly high, higher than any other place in the United States that has ever been investigated to date.
The Silence. Watch online or on air beginning April 19th.
The effects of disease epidemics experienced by Alaska Natives is just as deadly and traumatic. Russian traders and explorers brought syphilis, tuberculosis, leprosy. Alaska Natives suffered immensely because they had no prior immunity or natural defenses. Possibly the worst devastation took place on the northern part of the coast. The smallpox epidemic of 1835 to 1838 spread from village to village in Tlingit Territory to Kodiak Island, and many families lost their main providers. Death was not the only consequence. Many were forced to leave their homes. In the 1840s, Kodiak's 65 settlements were consolidated to 7, and instead of traditional earthen hovels, the natives lived in wooden huts, causing further social distress. In 1909, the native population was at its lowest point, with only 25,331 people. Inability to access healthcare, in addition to inadequate housing and sanitation, continued the trend of high death rates into the 1950s. Historical trauma explains many of the social issues affecting Alaska Natives today. The theory of historical trauma for Alaska Natives means cultural devastation by illness, depletion of natural food stock, discredit of traditional religion, language, and native roles. Long-term effects of historical trauma can be seen in Alaska Natives today. Symptoms of historical loss include, but are not limited to, depression, substance abuse, diabetes, dysfunctional parenting, unemployment, PTSD, community and interpersonal violence. Societal environmental issues include a 3.5 times higher rate of domestic violence and physical and sexual assault within Native communities than the national average. Native American children are among the highest groups represented in the Child Protective Care Services. Native populations have the highest weekly alcohol consumption of any ethnic group. Native populations also have a shorter life expectancy and higher rates of depression, heart disease, diabetes, tuberculosis, and sexually transmitted infections. These examples may help clarify why Native communities are suffering with such emotional, physical, and social environmental consequences directly linked to the cultural turmoil experienced by their ancestors. When cultural patterns and identities are lost, the community is left with no protection against oppression and aggression.